So good morning, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. I will be moderating the session this morning. And so now it's 11 o'clock, so we can start. So I've a short introduction. So this is the second webinar in a series of webinars organized by 3 European projects. That's PARIS, AVENGERS, and ICOS. And together we've formed, let's say, a consortium of consortia, which we call AVPAR, so for short for AVENGERS, ICLIMA and PARIS. And as one of our outreach activities, we have a webinar with approximately 2 webinars per year. And so this webinar is going to be about F-gas emissions and estimating emissions using atmospheric observations. And yes, I'd just like to introduce, we have 2 speakers this morning. They are Professor Andreas Stohl, who is at the University of Vienna. And he studies and models atmospheric processes, and especially the transport of gases in the atmosphere. And he's also the main developer of the Lagrangian model called, well, there's 2 models, FlexTra and FlexPart. And he's also the co-leader of a work package in ICLIMA on atmospheric inverse modeling. Our second speaker is Dr. Andreas Engel from Goethe University in Frankfurt. And Dr. Engel studies chemical composition of the atmosphere and more recently the coupling of climate change and changes in stratospheric ozone. And Dr. Engel is also a work package leader in the PARIS project. And also just before we start, just a few technical or bit of information. So for questions, we suggest that you write your questions in the chat, and then we will take all the questions after the second speaker. And during that discussion session at the end, I will read out the questions that are in the chat, but then you also have the opportunity to raise your virtual hand. And also, if you want to ask your question that way, that is also fine as well. Okay, so now I give the floor to Andreas Stohl, and yes.
Right. So I'm sharing my screen now. I hope you can see it.
Yes, that's good.
Good. All right. So then my talk is about inverse modeling, basically, of F-gases. So how can we use inverse modeling to determine the sources of F-gases? And the talk is basically based on PhD thesis of Martin Wolter and the papers that come out of this study and the master thesis of Benjamin Püschel. And I took most of the slides from one of these 2 theses, especially a lot from Martin Wolter. I really want to acknowledge them for that. So what are F-gases? F-gases are fluorine-containing synthetic compounds. There's a whole range of them, CFCs, HCFCs, HFCs. So these are kind of ozone-destroying substances that have been replaced with less and less dangerous to the ozone layer substances. But then also perfluorocarbons, SF6 and NF3 that do not damage to the ozone layer, but very powerful greenhouse gases. So the sources are almost 100% anthropogenic, and for the different species, they have very different sources. So this could be refrigerants, feedstocks for other products, the semiconductor industry, high voltage switchgear for SF6, for instance, or aluminum production for the perfluorocarbons, for instance. And there is point sources, mostly factories producing these substances, as well as area sources. Most of the substances have high global warming potential, 100. So for SF6, for instance, 24,300. For PFC, 116. So C2F6, it's about 12,400. But actually, these numbers are kind of misleading because they are calculated over a 100-year time horizon, whereas most of these gases have longer, or many of these gases have actually longer lifetimes. So for SF6, for instance, 1,000 years, C2F6, 10,000 years or even longer. This is making them particularly problematic greenhouse gases if they are not regulated because they simply accumulate in the atmosphere. They are regulated under the Montreal and or the Kyoto Protocol and also national regulations such as the EU's F-gas regulation. Still, we see that many of these substances are increasing in the atmosphere. So here, for instance, for SF6 and C2F6, both are increasing, and the rate of the increase is actually not decreasing, meaning that the emissions are actually still increasing, or at least not decreasing. And that's the case for some of these substances are kind of, the emissions are decreasing, but for many they are still increasing, and especially the very problematic long-lived ones. So why do we need inverse modeling of these F-gas emissions? Well, we can use bottom-up inventories to determine the emissions. These are based on production and consumption data and some proxy data for distributing the emissions. But first of all, they are, especially for F-gases, often not very reliable, and I will show you some examples later how poorly the bottom-up inventories sometimes perform. And it is becoming increasingly important to verify the compliance with regulations, and this can only be done by using observations in the atmosphere. And this is where top-down, so-called top-down methods come into play, where inverse methods are used to infer the emissions basically from observations, from a transport model, and then usually a Bayesian inversion framework. The global emissions of most of these, especially of the long-lived substances, can be determined quite easily because kind of if you know the increase of the substance in the atmosphere from the growth rate, you basically also know the emissions. But the problem are the regional, the national, and the point source emissions, and that is much more challenging. So how do we do inverse modeling? So for regional inverse modeling of the F-gases, it's mostly Lagrangian transport models that are being used. And that's also the case here. So I will show the examples for the Lagrangian model FlexPart that Rona has already mentioned, and the inversion system FlexInvert Plus. Of course, this, as you will see, is the most sophisticated framework for F-gases that exists. Maybe. So how do these Lagrangian models work? Basically, if we have a measurement somewhere in the atmosphere, we release particles at these measurement stations, and we kind of track them backward in time. And these particles are moving around, and it's of course not only one particle, but in reality we release something on the order of 50,000 particles for every single measurement. And by recording the path of these particles and also accounting for loss rates like OH reaction and so on, we get a sensitivity that we can kind of superimpose on an emission grid. And this emission sensitivity tells you how sensitive the model concentration at the receptor, so at the measurement station, is to emissions kind of from each of these grid cells. And if you multiply this with an emission from this grid cell, you get the concentration or a mole fraction at the receptor. However, we cannot trace the particles backward in time forever. So typically, these particles are tracked for 5 to 50 days. We even track them now up to 100 days. But eventually, kind of, you have to stop the backward simulation. You cannot account for a 1,000-year lifetime, of course. And that also means that kind of if you go back, so in this example, for instance, 13 days, that some of these kind of emissions will remain unaccounted for in the simulation. So the blue grid cells, all these are emissions that that are not accounted for in the inversion. And this is very often called the baseline. Whereas kind of this emission sensitivity that is calculated during the calculation time is called the source receptor relationship, which is also known as the footprint or as the emission sensitivity. Now, one thing is, of course, this baseline should depend on the time that you kind of simulate backward in time. It's clear that if you, for instance, here simulate only 8 days backward instead of 13 days, there must be more contributions in the baseline. So the baseline must be higher than for the 13-day simulation, because here you only account for emissions during the last 8 days. So it's clear that that the baseline in this second case must be higher than in the first. And that is what is being ignored by most inversion frameworks. So we try to really kind of account for that. And I'll give you one example here. This is a backward simulation, and that's just showing this emission sensitivity or source receptor relationship for a station in Ireland, Macehead, and the SF6 measurements at the same time. So you see as this emission sensitivity moves around the globe, when the emission sensitivity, this retro plume, as we also call it, hits Europe, you see a maximum in the SF6 mole fractions. And this is, of course, the contribution mostly from Europe. But of course, as you can also see, this is only an enhancement of maybe 0.3 ppt, whereas the 10 ppt background is basically what was there before, even before this, in this case, 50-day simulation. And it's very important to have an accurate estimate of this background, because otherwise you're putting any error that you make in this baseline basically into the emission estimate. So you can bias your emission estimate by errors in this baseline. So how do we actually then get this baseline? We not only store the emission sensitivity from the model simulation, but at the end of each particle path, so let's say after 50 days, we also store the sensitivity to the initial conditions. And these initial conditions are basically global 3D mole fraction fields that we have to take from somewhere. And they have to be interfaced at the right time, so 50 days before the measurement basically have to be interfaced with the sensitivity that we get from the model. But now the problem is, of course, and these global mole fraction fields should include all the emissions kind of up to 50 days before, but not the emissions kind of during this 50 days, of course. So how do we get this time varying kind of 3D field? This is problematic for the F gases because unlike for CO2 or methane, there are no reanalysis products available. So there is no global concentration fields basically for these F gases available. For methane or CO2, you can get products from ESMWF and other data sources. But for the F gases, this is basically not existing. So we have to construct these kind of global mole fraction fields ourselves, and we do this with a special version of FlexPart, or a kind of a special option of FlexPart, which is called FlexPart LCM, linear chemistry model. This works, we distribute particles globally in the atmosphere, usually about 50 million or even more. And these particles move completely freely in the atmosphere.
Thank you.
And they are moving forward in time. And if a particle kind of moves and comes by an emission source, it takes up emissions. And that way kind of we simulate the global 3D concentration field. But of course, the emissions are wrong. We know that they are wrong and we want to correct them in the inversion, of course. So what we also do is when a particle comes by a measurement station, so here's a network for SF6. So if this particle comes by a measurement station, we actually correct the mole fraction on that particle. And that way we keep the modeled mole fractions very close to the observations. So this is basically a simple data assimilation system. Now this, the next slide actually shows a result for the Gosan station, which is in Southeast Asia, in Korea. I showed this for two simulations, one just going back 5 days in time, and the other one going back 50 days in time. And as I said, the baseline has to account for the difference between the simulation periods. Otherwise, we are kind of biasing our emission estimates later on. And what you see is kind of the dark brown line is the baseline, and the light, this orange line, is the emission contributions during the last 5 days on the left-hand side and 50 days on the right-hand side. And what you see is exactly what we expect kind of for the 50 days. We get the lower baseline. What you also see is that the baseline is quite variable. So this is also contrary to many other methods. We get a very variable baseline, and this is very good because in this case, for instance, we see excursions, especially if you look at the right-hand figure where the baseline is already much cleaner than for the only 5 days backward. The baseline basically decreases episodically in summer. And this is incursion of monsoon air from the southern hemisphere. So we get cleaner air from the southern hemisphere. And of course, this should be should have a lower baseline. If we assume the same baseline for this air mass, then just a few days before or so, or even a few hours before, we make a big mistake, maybe in the emission estimate. So basically, we can account for meteorological variability in this baseline. And we also can account for exactly for the simulation period. Usually we use quite long backward simulation periods because they perform better. You have kind of more high resolution, more particles kind of in the backward plume than in the forward simulation. And also we can account for larger areas, so we get more information on emissions that are further away from the measurement stations. And given that the measurement network is not very dense, basically this is a big advantage. So for SF6, and I'm now coming to the examples, this is measurements of SF6. You see the measurement network on the left, and we also can use moving platforms, both flash sample measurements as well as high frequency samples. And this is the emission sensitivity that you get from these measurements. You can see that the emission sensitivity with this long 50-day backward runs is quite well distributed, but still, of course, we have large gaps. This is a logarithmic scale, so it means that over South America, Africa, and especially also over India and also Australia, we have quite low sensitivity. So that means also low information on the emissions in these regions, but still better than if we would use shorter lifetimes. And this is important to also kind of come to consistent global emissions with the regional inversion, because one problem of the regional inversions is often that you don't get accurate global emissions. If you add up all the emission contributions from the from the different regions, you end up with something that is wrong globally, and you know that it's wrong because the growth rate constrains that. So then for the inversion, we also need a priori emissions. So this is, for instance, from EDGAR, GAINS, and just from the UNFCCC reports. I'm not going into detail here. Basically, mathematically, what we do, and this is what I've shown before, the modeled mole fraction is basically the emission sensitivity times the emission over the 50-day time frame, plus the sensitivity to the initial conditions times the 3D mole fractions. And we can put all of this in together, the H and the E and the Y in variable H and X. And that's what is kind of being optimized or used for the optimization in the inversion framework. I don't really want to explain the mathematics really behind. We solve a cost function that has two terms. One is the right-hand side is kind of the difference that minimizes the difference to the observations. So the model should be as close as possible to the observations. But this leads to problem where we have low information content, basically, where there is little emission sensitivity. So this can lead to overfitting. And that's why we also need to constrain the emissions by prior emissions. And this is the left-hand term. So we also want the emissions to be as close as possible to the prior emissions. Usually this leads to large changes where we have a lot of information, so around measurement stations, for instance, but maybe in regions where we have little information, the solution will remain relatively close to the prior information. So now really coming to the results. These are SF6 emissions in the United States, and you can see how different the different emission estimates that we used are. So this is all prior information from the UNFCCC. EDGAR and GAINS, you can see that EDGAR here is kind of much higher than the others. All show a slightly decreasing trend. And that's what we get from the inversion using these three different priors and in black, the average of all these solutions, also with uncertainty ranges. And as you can see, at the beginning, actually the EDGAR was quite correct. So we get very similar results to the EDGAR prior at the very beginning. But at the end, actually, we are getting closer down to the GAINS and UNFCCC reports. Anyway, you can see that all these emission inventories were wrong at some time. So EDGAR was maybe correct at the beginning, and maybe GAINS and UNFCCC are not so wrong at the end, but the trend is completely wrong, and overall there's quite large errors in the emissions. So we also see kind of effects of introduction of new regulations. So this was the EPA greenhouse gas reporting program, for instance, that led to a reduction in the emissions that is not reflected really in the priors. We can also compare this to previous inversions on the regional scale. So for instance, this, and we get very similar results to this. If you look in the European Union, actually all the prior emissions, they agree quite well with each other, but they're all too low. And our inversions suggest quite a bit higher emissions than all the priors. And we also see a large reduction from 2017 to 2018, and this was exactly the time when leak detection systems were introduced for high voltage switch gears. And then also recycling of magnesium die casting alloys was the use of SF6 was prohibited. So we can also see effects of, monitor effects of regulations taking place. So these are just an example. These are the SF6 emissions in the European Union. I don't have the time to go into all of these plots. The right-hand plots give you uncertainty information. The top left plot gives you information on the difference of the a posteriori and the a priori. You see in some regions of Europe, there's large increases in the posteriori compared to the prior. And in some regions, there's reductions. I just want to draw your attention to a maximum. And if you look to the lower panel, which is the posterior emissions then in total, to this maximum over Germany, in southwest Germany. I don't want to say anything more because Andreas Engel will talk about more about this, which turns out to be a point source. Then SF6 emissions in China, that's kind of a big topic. All of the inventories suggest the large increase of these emissions, but at very different rates. The inversions do confirm this very large increase. Also, the reports to the UNFCCC are actually too low. So the green points are the UNFCCC reports from China. And they're all much too low, especially at the beginning. At the end, they agree much better with the inversion results. And we also are in agreement, again, with regional inversions done just for China. And if you look at the global emissions, you see that the prior is increasing, but quite homogeneously, which is not very realistic. And still, even on the global scale, we have differences in the prior emissions. In the posterior, we also have differences, but we see much more variability in the emissions. But the important thing here is that even with kind of these regional inversions, where we have information really on every grid cell, we end up with emission totals that are very close to the known, also point source, known sources from the box model. So we are quite happy that kind of these global emissions are quite correct, even though we do this on a regional scale. A further improvement, of course, is that we have done recently that, as I told you, that the global emissions do not always match the regional emissions. We have introduced a further constraint, so we bind the regional emissions to the global total. And this does not change the emissions in well-constrained regions very much, but it adjusts especially the emissions in poorly monitored areas. So that's now work from Benjamin Püschel. And he has looked at C2F6 emissions. So these are global emissions of C2F6. And what you see is prior estimates, bottom-up estimates. These are all these bars. You can see they are very low, especially the UNFCCC reports in most years are very, very low compared to the lines, which are the top-down results. So the red is again our top-down result, and the kind of gray shading are regional, are estimates from a global box model, basically. And again, we are relatively close to the global box model, but if we add this global constraint, we get even closer, and this is the broken line, kind of the dashed line. We get even closer to the global total. But again, as for SF6, the emissions are in the bottom-up inventories are mostly under, and this, for this species particularly, mostly underestimated, quite severely. We can also look into different regions. So for instance, this is China. And here you can see again that most of the bottom-up inventories in China especially underestimate the emissions totally by a factor of 4 or 5, partly even more. More recent bottom-up inventories like the one by Guo et al. So these are the green bars. They are more reasonable. They are getting closer to what we get, the lines here from the inversion. And also some recent inversion studies for China using regional Chinese data are quite similar to ours, even a little bit higher than the results that we get for China. And of course, since we do this kind of for the whole globe and for all regions, we can also split up the emissions. And here you see the emission split for different countries for 3 different periods in the last 15 years. And you see kind of that China, even kind of at the beginning of this period, had more than 1/3 of contribution of the C2F6 emissions, but this has further increased and is now, or in the most recent period, already above 50% of the global emissions. And you can see that the contribution also of the other countries. So concluding, I want to say that inverse modeling really is a powerful tool to determine F-gas emissions. The problem is actually less complicated to solve than inversions maybe for methane or CO2. So here, I think this works actually better. We now also have a single system that in principle can determine global, regional, national, and also subnational and point source emissions in one go, in one fully consistent single inversion framework. We have a system that is efficient enough to perform really thousands of inversions. And this allows us to also now do Latin hypercube sampling, varying various parameters that go into the inversion. So this is work that is in preparation by my postdoc Nabavi. This is for characterizing really the emissions in uncertainties better in the future. But of course, we still have large uncertainties in undersampled regions, so Africa, Latin America, India, for instance. And of course, more observations are always welcome. And Andreas will next talk about the observations mostly. Thank you for your attention.
Yes, thanks very much, Andreas. It was a very interesting talk. And now we're going to hear more, I understand, more from the observation side from Dr. Andreas Engel. So I invite you now to give your presentation. And we'll take all questions at the end.
Okay. I think, Andy, are you still sharing your screen?
No, actually not.
It's okay. I can share now. Right. Okay. So, I hope you can all see my screen. And let me use my laser pointer here. Yes, Andreas, I think, has given a really nice overview of the power of inverse modeling. And what is obvious is if we want to do inverse modeling, we need good observations. So we need good observations which are consistent with each other. And first of all, being in Europe, of course, what we want to look at is what is the European network? How can we expand this to have observations covering the whole of Europe? And so my talk is about how can we expand this? What are the challenges? And what are the opportunities which we can get from this? First of all, it's a really challenging analytical problem. We have a wide range of boiling points for these species, from CF4, which has a boiling point of -128 degrees, and looking at the HFCs, HFC 4310 MeE is probably the least volatile with a boiling point of 55 degrees centigrade. But we also want to expand this to ozone depleting substances. So we're looking at species like bromoform, which have 150 degrees. So we have a range of species with very large different physicochemical behavior. Secondly, we have really low concentrations. A lot of these species are in the PPT or even sub-PPT region, a PPT being a part per trillion. And here is a small graphic showing you what a part per trillion is. It's like having a single drop of water in 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And we want to measure that with high precision and high accuracy. And high accuracy actually means that we need a good intercomparability between the different measurement stations. Because as Andreas has shown, you want to combine different stations to get emissions. So we need a central calibration so that we are all reporting on the scale that the measurements can be compared to each other. And the 16 most important F-gases, and these are the ones we have concentrated on within the Paris project, are listed here. I'm not going to read through all of them. They wouldn't tell you anything anyway. It's hydrofluorocarbons, but it's also perfluorated compounds, NF3 and SF6. Those are, let's say, the target species when we talk about F-gases. But there are many other fluorine and bromine containing gases, and in total we're probably measuring like 40 to 50 different gases if we want to quantify the whole family of these gases. So how do we measure them actually? The technique which we use for most of the F gases is gas chromatography with cryogenic pre-concentration. Because we're talking about such low concentrations, we have to somehow pre-concentrate our sample, and we do that by concentrating the condensable species within 2 liters of air, typically, which needs to be dried. So there's a lot of technical issues we need to take into account. And we do this on a small sample loop, which has maybe 1.5 milliliters, and we can then inject that onto a chromatographic column, which is a column where we can separate these species from each other so that we can then detect them separately. And we need to measure a hierarchy of standards regularly so that we can propagate the absolute calibration values from the central calibration lab to the individual measurements station. And in our case, the central calibration lab for, I think, most of the F-gas measurements, with the exception of SF6 in Europe, is actually the Scripps Institute of Oceanography at the University of California in San Diego, which is sort of the central calibration lab for the A-gauge measurement network, and I'm going to show a bit about that in a moment. And in the end, these absolute scales can be tracked down to gravimetric standards, which have to be prepared for every individual substance. So it's really a lot of work involved in that. And what we then want to do is we want to have common instrumentation so that all the measurements rely on the same technique, and we have actually the same problems, because we find out, and we have a very open data exchange policy within our A-gauge network, for example. So we find out that we have a very common problems, and we see problems which arise on one instrument. Very often we see them on another one, and so due to this collaboration, we can improve our understanding of the measurement technique. And here is the measurement network for the F gases. So Andy has shown something for SF6. SF6 has a much denser network because it's much easier to measure, but these F gases are much more difficult, and you need this whole GCMS system. So here is the network, and as we saw before, there's completely undersampled regions like South America and a large part of India. This is from the WMO 2022 reports. Some changes have occurred in the time since. For example, China is currently developing an independent network, and we're looking at ways that they can collaborate with the A-gauge network also. But so they are setting up a network of their own, which would be then largely independent of the A-gauge network. And as you see here, the second network which exists globally is the NOAA network. So both of them are centered in or say both of them have certainly their calibration centers in the US. Very briefly, very briefly, the technique which we use is the GCMS, and the instrument which we try to use within the A-gauge network is the so-called Medusa instrument. It's a really complicated instrument. It has a Stirling cooler to get down to these low temperatures. We need Nafion dryers to dry the sample. We have a range 6 multi-position valves which switch the gas flows back and forth. 3 different chromatographic columns. Many of these are custom components which are only produced or made by ourselves for the network. So it's a very complicated technique. But the nice thing is this instrument is now, and that's since about 2 years, it's commercially available. So we're getting closer to having this instrument available for other stations so that more people can use it. So what is the situation in Europe with respect to F-gases? So let's say pre-Paris, there were 5 stations in Europe measuring the F-gases. That is within the A-gauge network. That's Macehead in Ireland. Andy has shown that already. Tattleston. Then we have Zeppelin on Spitzbergen, so very high up in the north. We have the Jungfraujoch and Montecimone, which have been measuring them. And the new stations which we introduced within the Paris project is Cabau, where we are taking samples, the Taunus Observatory, where we have installed a new Medusa system to run continuous measurements. We're taking samples in Birkenes and in Hungary, and we have installed another continuous station in Italy, in Sicily at Capo Granitola. And the emphasis on the old network, let's put it like that, is mainly clean air stations. And now the emphasis is more and more switching towards stations which are closer to pollution sources, so that we can pick up these pollution informations which Andy has talked about. So there's also new stations coming up outside of the Paris project. The Zugspitze, run by the German Umweltbundesamt, is progressively making really good measurements. We have 2 new stations in the UK which are coming up, and from the DEC network. And the Taunus Observatory is now in full A-gauge station, and also Cabau in the Netherlands will hopefully switch in 2026 and have a Medusa instrument so that we get continuous measurements. So there's a good chance that our network will improve further even after these projects. Okay, let's show you a bit of the data. So this is from our data quality control meeting, which we actually had yesterday for the non-European or non-A-gauge, the European non-A-gauge stations. And what you can see here is 2 species which I have picked. It's HFC 143A and HFC 245FA. And what you can see is the new stations here, partly these are FLAST stations. And then in blue, I have added the Zeppelin station, which is a real background station. And you can see 2 kind of informations, which Andy has also mentioned. The global information, let's call it like that. That's the long-term increase that gives us the global emission. And then we have these enhancement above the local, above the global mean or above the background value. And that's what carries the regional information. And you see that for different sites, we have different signatures for the different compounds. And switching to 2 more species, here is showing you also some of the analytical challenges that we are facing. So here is a species which is HFC 236FA, and you see that the concentration or the mixing ratio we are talking about here is on the order of 1/4 of a part per trillion, and still we want to measure that with high precision, and you can see that some of the instruments are struggling to get there. So the analytics is really challenging. And then there are species which are really very difficult to measure. And for example, NF3 is a species we can currently only measure with the Medusa instrument. So not all of the stations will be able to provide all of the measurements. And just as an sort of as an example, what a larger network can actually provide, and Andy already mentioned that we were going to look at this. So SF6, because the analytics for SF6 are much easier, has a much denser network, which is shown here on the left, is a combination of A-gauge sites, measurements under the Paris project, UK DEC network, and ICOS samples, which are analyzed for SF6. And from that, we get a pretty dense network within Europe. And we have used that together with Alistair Manning and and his group at UK Met Office, Alison Reddington, to derive from these observations the emissions in a similar way as Andy has shown this. And what we have further done is we have compared this to bottom-up inventories. So here's the bottom-up inventories for 2020, 21, and 22 for SF6 from Germany. And you see that the main source is actually supposed to be soundproof windows, which were used in Germany a lot, and they were filled with SF6. So it sort of ended, this application ended around 2005 or something like that. So the bottom up really assumes now that this emission is going down very quickly, but it's still assumed that it's the main emission source in Germany. Now, if we apply this top down, the inversion, and we are using results from the INTEM model from the UK Met Office. Alistair and Alison have provided this, but also we have compared this to flex invert calculations from Andreas Stohl and Martin Beuter. And what you can see is that we don't get an even distribution throughout Germany, but we get this hotspot within southwestern Western Germany. Interestingly, the total emissions, both derived from INTEM and from flex invert, for Germany agree pretty well with the reported bottom-up emissions, but the distribution is not what would be expected. So there is this highlight or this hotspot region, which is responsible for about a third of the German emissions, according to our calculations. And this is consistent between INTEM and flex invert. And again, surprisingly, this is also the area which hosts the only SF6 production and recycling factory within Europe. So I think it's very, very likely and very that the emissions come from this factory. So what we can see here is that the regional distribution is really inconsistent between bottom up and top down, and this gives us a further information. So that's what we need the dense network for. Okay, summary, conclusions, and a look ahead. We need long-term observations to derive these emissions using the inverse modeling, but long-term observations require long-term thinking, and that means funding, infrastructure, personnel, and expertise, because these measurements, to do them on a high quality level as they are needed, is something which is far from trivial. And actually, many of the observations we currently have are on project budget and probably cannot sustained once, for example, the Paris project is over. Despite there being EU regulations on the F-gases, the F-gas regulation, but also the MAC directive for emissions from air conditioning systems in motor vehicles in place. So there is a need for this verification. And the high quality data and the sustained atmospheric observations are the basis for the inverse modeling and therefore for reliable top-down emission estimates. And the current observational system, which gives us the information for Europe, is either part of A-gauge or is linked to A-gauge, and it depends on US provided calibration scales and software. And so there is really an urgent need for a larger independence from the US, in particular if we want to grow this network, because A-gauge will not be able to provide calibration for all of the new stations which are coming up. So what we would dream of is a European, and that I'm talking about continental scale, not EU 27 infrastructure, because actually 3 of the countries which have continuous measurements of F-gases at the moment, it's Switzerland, Norway, and the UK, are not part of the EU. So a large part of the information we have is not from the EU 27. So we would need an organization for a sufficiently dense and well-distributed network. Currently, actually, it's a bit like, well, we have stations at places where maybe somebody has taken initiative, but actually you would like to have places where you get the best sensitivity to constrain the observations. Sustained funding for this network would be needed. Good provision of calibration scales, software, data quality control, and actually I think also the inverse modeling and derivation of top-down emission estimates should be included in such an infrastructure. But that's of course a dream, and with that, with my dream, I'm at the end of my talk.
Thanks very much, Andreas, and to both our speakers for these very interesting talks. We have time now to take some questions, and I see there have already been a couple of questions in the chat, which have already been answered too, I think, all of them. But if you have other questions, feel free to write that in the chat, or you can also raise your virtual hand, and we can also take questions that way. I'm just looking, I don't see any questions at the moment. So I have a question perhaps to Andreas Stohl. So in your presentation, you showed that there can be some interannual variations in the emissions. I think you showed, it may have been for China and the emissions, that there are some changes from year to year. And you showed that by adding this additional global constraint, that this is dampened down, but there are still some variations. And I was just wondering, I mean, how much of that variability do you think can really be attributed to changes in the emissions? And if so, do you see that could be reflecting perhaps an economic situation of a given year, or in the case for Europe, you showed that there may have been an influence of policy on, and also for the US, an influence of policy on the emissions.
Yeah, we also think that some of the variability in China is actually due to the introduction of policies. But of course, I also would agree that some of this interannual variability is also a bit artificial. So we kind of see that the uncertainty estimates are usually that we get from the inversions, and that is not only in our inversion framework, but from quite many inversion frameworks. The uncertainties, I would say, are sometimes a bit optimistic. So you see very often that you have very narrow uncertainties, but at the same time, quite high interannual variability. It's actually not so high in our case, but sometimes you really see interannual variability that is 5 or 10 times higher than the uncertainty estimate. And that is a clear indication that maybe something is not working exactly as it should, and some of these interannual variability is actually artificial. So yeah, it's a mix between real signals, and sometimes we can really explain, like in Europe, this large drop, also in the US, and also in China, we have one drop that I think we can, or one change that we can explain, but it's not always the case. So you have to be careful indeed.
Thanks very much. We have now also a question in the chat from Peter. I think this is addressed to Andreas Engel. He says, I think I heard that NOAA was losing funding. Are there any concrete plans to establish calibration outside the US?
Well, we are talking about it, that we need this, but it's I mean, as I said, we're talking about something like 40 to 50 different species. So we're certainly not going to set up any completely new and independent calibration scales. But the idea would be that we try at least to have a European hub that we can distribute calibrations. I think and it's not only NOAA actually. NOAA is losing a lot of the funding, but we, from the A-Gauge network, we're not depending on NOAA. We're depending on Scripps, and but Scripps again is also, of course, depending on funding. So yes, the whole situation is far from stable, and it would be desirable to have something. But as I said, it wouldn't. It's something we don't need on a EU 27 scale. It's something we need on on a continental scale, actually.
Thank you very much for your reply. We have some more questions coming in on the chat. So Oksana is asking, are there related standards in the metrology community to provide them to the network? I guess that's again, perhaps addressed to you, Andreas Engel.
Well, the Swiss Metas is making some calibration scales for, let's say, some of the more exotic compounds. So partly the answer could be yes, there are that the metrology community could be able to do this, but it's a big task. It's not something like which can be done in half a year or something like that. And so currently only the Metas, the Swiss metrology is really set up to do calibration scales.
Yes, thank you. We have also somebody wanting to ask a question. Their name doesn't appear fully here, but TVC, if you would like to ask a question.
I'm Wolf from NILU. Can I add one question? Is that you use a lot of method to know what's happening about information about the AVENGERS, but I'm concerned about the local source of the AVENGERS because and I know that the public authority, they may interested in to see what is the main local source, but what you see in some station, for example, in Zeppelin and other station, and some you use invert modeling to know the information about the AVENGERS. But what is the method? For example, information, you measure something in the Zeppelin, but can we able right now to extract the local source of the AVENGERS, for example, from somewhere China in very fine scale of the local source, or we're not able yet? What is the methodology to, based on the observation, to go back and to know the local source of the AVENGERS?
I think that
some local, for example, some factory, some specific place with the high emission for industry in China or somewhere, for example, how to know exactly where is the local source of the AVENGERS?
Yeah,
to
I think
have
it's
a
probably
control.
best addressed to Andreas Stohl. So I guess it's concerning the resolution at which you estimate the emissions, and how can you be sure, I guess, that the inversion is placing the emissions in the right locations.
Yeah, if I understood correctly, the question is also about kind of how far can a station be away, maybe from a source. So when we go backward in time from a station, we are adding information every day we go back. But the information that is being added about the emissions is becoming less and less with every additional day. So maybe the first day is the most valuable. So this is kind of just around the station in the real vicinity. The second day, which is a bit further away, will have a much poorer constraint because kind of this backward plume is already much dispersed after 2 days. And this gets less and less and less. So by going further backward in time, we are able to kind of get a better estimate, especially of the global emissions. But the resolving power becomes less and less the further back we go, the additional resolving power. So it doesn't become worse. It always becomes better if you go further back in time, but it doesn't really add a lot. So I would not say that if you take measurements at Zeppelin station, you can say much about the emissions in China. I mean, you can definitely constrain the global emissions even with a single station for these long-lived gases, but I would not use Zeppelin, especially not alone, to constrain emissions in any areas that are very, very far from Zeppelin. So Zeppelin is a very isolated station. It doesn't tell you a lot about emissions at all because there are no emissions in the vicinity, basically.
Yeah, thank you. That is just example. I mean, the emissions AVENGERS information in Europe, how it relationship with local source in China and India or some other. The relationship between the local source from in China, in industry in China and in some in India, and how it what is the relationship with local source with the water emission in Europe, for example.
Well, I don't understand quite the question. How emissions in China would relate to emissions in measurements in Europe. I'm not quite sure what you mean.
The local sulfur in China, how it related to the emissions in the F-gas concentration in Europe, for example?
Well, I mean, it's mostly these are very long-lived gases, so it doesn't matter where. Like for the background that I've talked about, kind of this baseline. Basically, for this it doesn't really matter. So we want to go back as far as kind of when we don't have any information anymore about local emissions. So this baseline is influenced equally, more or less equally, by all emissions.
Yep. Thank you.
So emission in China will also influence, of course, the baseline in Europe and everywhere else.
Right. Thank you very much for the reply, Andreas. We have two last questions in the chat, and I think that's probably about all that we have time for. So Ray is asking the question, have the environmental authorities had discussions with the SF6 manufacturer in Germany to try to verify what is causing this large point source? I suppose that's probably best addressed to Andreas Engel.
Yeah. Well, we have been in contact with the local environmental authorities and also with the German Umweltbundesamt. First of all, they were very surprised because the emissions, there are no, or the emissions reported from this factory are on the order of 50 to 60 kilograms per year. From our inversions, we get something on the order of 20 to 30 tons, so it's much higher. And we had discussions both with the local authorities and also with the company itself. They have started looking at the processes which they are using, and have found that there are some places where there may be leaks which they hadn't suspected. But I think it's something which is coming to our attention much more, that the emissions, the fugitive emissions from the use of gaseous compounds is much higher than is expected in bottom-up inventory compiling, because usually industry will assume that if there is a closed circuit process, then the emissions are close to zero. But in reality, we know that this is not the case, and this is something which is emerging for more and more species, that this is not the case.
Thanks very much. And we have time just for one last question. Zantanim is asking, I was wondering whether Andreas Stohl could elaborate a bit more on the uncertainty in the inversion systems. Why could they be too low? What is not being taken into account by determining the uncertainties?
Yeah, so it all starts with the prior emissions, and usually kind of the inventories that we get or sometimes have to self-construct because it doesn't even exist. So we have to compile them partly ourselves from UNFCCC reports and so on. But even if, like Edgar has emission inventories, very often there is no uncertainty reported. So we have to guess the uncertainty basically even in the prior. So this is completely independent of the inversion system. We are starting with a wrong assumption on the uncertainties. And we usually assume that the uncertainties are on the order of 50. So for SF6, we have assumed 50%. For SF6, we have assumed 100% uncertainty. But I tend to believe that this is much too low, actually, and we should use much, much higher uncertainties on a grid cell level, because kind of this has to be specified on the grid cell, not on a national level. And if you start with, let's say, 50% uncertainties, once you kind of aggregate this into a national total estimate, then of course, due to error propagation, this is kind of being reduced, and then you end up with a much too low uncertainty. And I think that is something that many of the colleagues and also we are struggling, that we, I think, tend to underestimate these uncertainties. So it would be great. First of all, it would be great to have better uncertainty characterizations in the prior emissions. And then second, I think we also need to think about how we actually specify the uncertainties. I think we are not doing this in the right way at the moment. So this is indeed a problem, and I hope we will do better in the future, actually.
So thanks, Andreas, for the reply. And I'd just like to thank both our speakers for giving this webinar today. I see there are a couple more questions coming up in the chat, but I'm afraid that we don't really have time. There will be, I understand that, I mean, the presentations have been recorded and they will be available. So I'm not sure if the ICOS communications team will send out.
Yeah, I will, once the recording at least is available, I can send a link to everyone who filled out the registration form, the recording. But the slides, I guess it would be up to the discretion of the presenters whether they'd want to be shared.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks everyone, and yeah. Okay. Have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.